Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Mateo, and I serve as Deputy Director of Programs and Partnerships at Carnegie Council. To begin, I'd like to welcome you all to the first event in the Council's Ethics Empowered Leadership and Practice series, which convenes scholars and practitioners to discuss pressing moral issues, reflect on their careers, and offer insights to young leaders. During today's panel, we will have the opportunity to explore the moral dilemmas and political trade-offs that UN peacekeeping operations present for both multilateral actors and local communities. It is my pleasure to now introduce our moderator for this event, Yuris Papshinoks, Associate Professor of Political Science at Marist University and member of Carnegie Council's Next Gen Advisory Board. We're also honored to welcome panelists Jean-Marie Geheno, Arnold A. Saltzman, Professor of Practice in International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, and former United Nations Undersecretary General for Peacekeeping Operations. Alongside Jennifer Welsh, Professor and Canada 150 Research Chair in Global Governance and Security, and Director of the Center for International Peace and Security Studies at McGill University. Before I pass the microphone to Yuris, a reminder to please submit your questions for our panelists directly via the chat feature. Following the event, our team will publish the full event as a video, podcast, and transcript, alongside additional educational resources and discussion questions that can be leveraged in the classroom. As I join you from the Council's Global Ethics Hub in New York City, I want to welcome you again and will now pass the program over to Yuris.
Okay, thank you, Brian. So, for the next 40 minutes, we will explore moral dilemmas and political trade-offs in peacekeeping operations with our two distinguished panelists. After that, for about 15 minutes or so at the very end, we will do a Q&A session. So, as Brian already mentioned earlier, please submit your questions at any time via the chat feature. So, this event overall is designed as a conversation where I'm going to ask certain questions to our panelists as we engage with nuances of peacekeeping ethics. So I want to start very broad with a more general question to Jennifer. So let's to kick us off. So what are the most common ethical dilemmas that peacekeepers face in conflict zones?
Thanks so much, and it's wonderful to be here with you. I think to start, we need to remember that peacekeeping is an activity guided by principles. It's principled action, if you will, and therefore it shouldn't surprise us that challenges and dilemmas should accompany it. So to get us started, I'll single out four of those. The first really relates to the principle of impartiality that underpins peacekeeping. So, UN operations are designed to treat all parties to a conflict fairly and without bias, and be even handed in their contact and implementation of the mandate. Not necessarily being neutral in the execution of their mandate, but impartial with respect to the conflict parties. And in part, this is to ensure that no single state's agenda dominates the mission. And the multinational composition of UN peacekeeping missions, there are personnel from a broad spectrum of countries, further reinforces that impartiality. So, Secretary General Guterres has recently described impartiality as the UN's strongest asset. But one of the key dilemmas is, how do you remain impartial in the use of force in peacekeeping? So we can take as an example the intervention brigades that were authorized in the Democratic Republic of Congo in 2013 as part of MONUSCO. And in large part, that was to assist in the protection of civilians. And here, concerns were raised about the mandate's language, which instructed MONUSCO to neutralize a particular armed actor, and also concerns about the brigade's close alignment with the Congolese armed forces and regional involvement in that particular aspect of the mission. Issues related to impartiality were also prominent in Mali, where MINUSMA was aiming to stabilize the country after a coup and insurrection. Many saw that mission as blurring the lines between peacekeeping and peace enforcement, and expectations from the host government and actually some of the countries in the region were that MINUSMA would engage in offensive counterterrorism operations. The mission wasn't mandated to do that, but MINUSMA nonetheless operated alongside French forces that were engaged in counterterrorism efforts and was co-located with them in some cases. So that's around impartiality, and I'm sure we can discuss more. The second dilemma relates to the way in which peacekeeping operations today, those that have protection of civilians mandates, manage the objectives of protection with the pursuit of political solutions to a conflict, which is the core of peacekeeping. So, in some instances, we can see that there can be tensions between what is sometimes referred to as the primacy of politics and the protection of civilians. For example, when advancement of a mission's immediate political goals makes civilian and uniformed personnel in a mission reluctant to confront national or local authorities over actions that threaten or harm civilians. And in particular, conflict parties and host governments often retain significant leverage and agency, which can limit the UN's ability to fully implement the mandate. And so this is something that is a constant tension for peacekeepers. A related dilemma around this has surrounded the need for the UN to respect the core operating principle of host state consent. Peacekeepers are there with the consent of the host state. But in some cases, maintaining that consent can require what we might call soft pedaling, any confrontation with national authorities with respect to their human rights violations. And so that's another area of tension that we can think about. And we can perhaps come back to whether that's a necessary tension or one that arises in practice. A third set of dilemmas I would refer to as the challenge of managing unintended consequences. And we can really see this in the UN's mission in South Sudan, UNMISS. So in December 2013, with the outbreak of civil war in South Sudan, tens of thousands of people who were targeted due to their ethnic backgrounds and perceived affiliation sought refuge in the UNMISS bases. And UNMISS established what were called POC, or protection of civilian sites, in and around those bases. And at their peak, they sheltered over 200,000 people, including many women and children. It was referred to as the decision to open the gates. And it was a very powerful symbol of the UN's commitment to protect populations. But this policy, as you can imagine, introduced a lot of challenges with unintended consequences. So they were originally intended to be temporary shelters, but they evolved into long-term refuges, straining resources from other priorities, and really raising considerable expectations about the scope of protection and the range of needs that the mission would fulfill. And we might even say, as a final point here, that UN peacekeepers veered into substituting for a state in its protection role, as opposed to supporting a state. And then a final tension to get us started is the tension that comes with partnering with other actors. So if any of you read the Secretary General's new agenda for peace, or have been paying attention to the Pact for the Future, you will see that one feature of our current era is the increasing number of situations that are featuring collaboration with non-UN missions and actors, many of which are regional. And part of the attraction of these, of course, lies in the perceived ability of these regional or other actors to provide more flexibility, more rapid responses to address insecurity in a state, help to back a state to exert control. And so really, these partnerships can help UN troops reduce violence with fewer blue helmets. But there are some dilemmas here that can accompany these sorts of parallel deployments or partnerships. They can create challenges in terms of local perceptions and trust building, because the local population might not distinguish between these different uniformed actors and their roles. And if we return to the idea of impartiality, there's also the risk that support for non-UN missions, particularly if they're sub-regional, will implicate the UN in supporting governments to fight particular opponents. And I'm thinking here of the G5 Sahel joint force. Some of these forces are also heavily reliant on only military personnel. And they have been described as engaging in overly securitized responses that can be problematic and even counterproductive over the long term. So, when we think about this as a dilemma, I think it has many faces, including the complications that arise if these forces are engaged in committing grave human rights abuses in the course of their operations. So, those are four to get our conversation started. I think in more recent years, there have been other principles and normative ideas that have come to the fore, including the importance of local agency in peace building or the need for more hybridity between international and local actors. And there are additional challenges related to those that we could come back to.
Okay. Thank you, Jennifer, for this very, very comprehensive response. You gave us a lot to think about. Now, I would like to switch gears a little bit and talk about organizing peacekeeping and dilemmas there. And who would be better to answer this question than Jean-Marie, who actually used to serve as the United Nations Under Secretary General for Peacekeeping Operations. So, Jean-Marie, what are key ethical dilemmas that senior political leaders face when they organize peacekeeping missions?
Well, much of what Jennifer just said applies also to senior leaders, dealing with other partners, balancing political goals with operational necessities. All that is the senior leaders have to confront. But what I would say the most difficult dilemma is that, as Jennifer said, peacekeeping is a principled activity. It has to be ethical, but it operates in a very political environment. And the member states, without which there is no peacekeeping, they have their own political goals. They are not just there for the good of humanity. They have their own national interests. And so, as you put together a peacekeeping operation, you have to manage that. That is, you have to be respectful of the member states. You have to understand their objectives, their goals. You have to, yes, in some ways, you have to accommodate them. But at the same time, you must not lose your ethical compass. You are not there just to serve the interest of the member states. You are there to harness them for to support a bigger goal, a greater goal for the international community, for the good of humanity, and that's quite complicated and difficult, and it raises questions on the level of ambitions you can have, because indeed, when you see a conflict situation, very often it's if a state is broken, there are deep roots to that tragedy, and you would want to address all of them. You know that you will not have the full support of member states to do that. So you have to do a kind of political triage, so to speak. You have to see what the market will bear. And that's difficult. And sometimes you get it right, and sometimes you get it wrong. I wasn't at the UN at the time, but when the UN had to, under pressure from member states, the concept of safe areas was invented for in Yugoslavia, and so that was a sort of promissory note to people that they would be protected in some specific areas. Now, to protect people, you need a certain quantity of troops. And of course, the member states were not prepared to give those troops in the numbers that would have been appropriate. And so you had to balance the need to have support from the member state and so not expose them too much with the operational realities. Obviously, there the United Nations got it wrong and accepted a compromise that was terrible because the promise could not be kept. So that's the very difficult dilemmas that one has to face. And I would end by saying there is a broader issue, which is that peacekeeping, it's about intervening in the lives of others. And there is a question of, in a way, the consequential responsibility that you have, because you know that the attention span of the international community is limited, and its will to engage in really following up on commitment, that is always uncertain. And so you know that the people you have come to help, at some point you will leave, that you will leave them to their own future. And it's their future, it's not your future. And so you have to to think how you define the goals of the mission so that when you leave, it doesn't all fall apart, and so that you haven't overpromised. And in some ways, that is one of the most difficult ethical dilemmas that you face as a senior leader.
Absolutely. Jean-Marie, if I may, a quick follow-up question. You mentioned already that protection of life of others is a key, if not the most important, mission of peacekeepers. So, how do peacekeepers balance this need to protect civilians against grave human rights violations with the principle of state sovereignty, especially if they are conducting peacekeeping mission in a state that is reluctant to have them?
Well, it's a problem that they face all the time, because you see, for instance, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, that the security forces of the state commit a lot of crimes, but they are the state. And so, can you confront the state? It's not easy. I think there, the fact that the United Nations has multiple faces, that there is an office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, allows for some distribution of roles, because you can have hard messages to the host nation that are not necessarily carried by the peacekeeping mission, but by other parts of the United Nations. But it's quite important that these messages be uttered, that the host country be confronted with the things it doesn't do right. But this question of protection of civilians, that arose after the tragedies of the 90s, the sense that if you don't protect civilians, why are you there? I think it's a highly political question, because you can think of protection in physical terms. What Jennifer was describing, for instance, for the destitute people who were protected by the UN in huge camps in Sudan. That's one aspect of it. But the long-term protection, it's the protection that will come from the country itself, when they have stood up, when they have built reliable political institutions. And the dilemma that you have is that often you focus on the short term, on the immediate protection, which in a way relieves the country of its duty to build a capacity to protect, so that when you see a policeman, you don't see that policeman as a threat. You see that policeman as a reassurance, or a soldier. And too often, yes, you see that policeman or that soldier as a threat. And so the host country too often thinks that, okay, it's the responsibility of the UN to do the protection. Meanwhile, the replacement for of that should be prepared for when the UN will leave, that is not being prepared. And that's very dangerous, because that means that when you leave, yes, you will have saved lives, but everything can fall apart, because there are no institutions behind to protect the people. That's, in a way, what we see in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where there have been 2 decades, more than 2 decades, a quarter century of UN presence. Is there a reliable security sector in which the population has trust? No. And so the UN mission is criticized for not doing enough, which is in some ways true. but at the same time, it hasn't prepared its exit in a convenient, in an effective way, and the government hasn't prepared that exit in an effective way.
Yeah. Thank you. So now turning to Jennifer, I know your research has touched on it, but let me ask this like the head on. So why do many think that peacekeeping is ineffective, especially in this country, and is it so?
It's a great question because I think, it partly relates to something that Jean-Marie was mentioning about the almost the tyranny of the immediate crisis and the way in which particular episodes of instability or civilian harm will will grab headlines and distract attention from the other things that a mission is doing, not just in terms of immediate protection, but building a protective environment and also um, pursuing political solutions. So we need to remember in thinking about effectiveness that peacekeepers operate in some of the most difficult conflict contexts. Jean Marie has huge knowledge of the context in the Congo. I was recently there at the end of November and could see, the myriad of different situations, even in one country, that the mission was trying to grapple with. Also, over a very wide geographic scope, and let's be honest, with very limited resources. And yet, what's interesting from the research is that the presence of peacekeepers really does correlate with a decrease in civilian casualties and targeting, and a reduction in the scope, the geographic scope of a conflict, and certainly reductions in subnational conflicts. So, this results from many different things that missions do: advocating with the parties, monitoring, patrolling, but also in some cases through action that actually separates combatants and tries to damper down battlefield activities that will trigger harm against civilians. Now, you might think, does this correlate at all with numbers? And certainly, if you look at the first decade of protection of civilians mandates, it certainly shows that the capacity to protect is strengthened with more peacekeepers there because it enhances the effects of all those activities I talked about. But it also signals the UN's resolve, both internally and with other audiences. But I think we also need to consider more recent research that shows it's not so much the overall quantity that matters, but rather the troop to population ratio, right, in an area, and the way in which perpetrators of violence are actually confronted. So it's much more micro, the determinants of what works. And so I guess we can think of the contribution of peacekeepers, if we're thinking of armed peacekeepers, as creating security through presence, right? Deterrence. And we should remember here that non-military parts of a mission are really important here because of the relationships that they form with local actors, with their dialogue that they're engaged in. So that presence is not just about troops or police, but also more recently, there have been efforts through training of troop contributing countries, contingents, and commanding officers, trying to encourage them to be a little bit less static, staying in their bases, and more proactive in how they conduct peacekeeping. So we've also heard the term protection through projection more recently. I think the caveat here, and Jean-Marie alluded to this, is that when you look at least the protection effects, they're not equally distributed. A peacekeeping presence enhances effectiveness against abuses by non-state armed groups more than it does in terms of harm perpetrated by host state forces. So it's a little uneven in terms of the effects I've discussed. And I think, lastly, I would just say on the political side, there are so many factors that affect whether a peacekeeping mission is going to succeed in terms of reaching its political objectives. And Jean-Marie indicated this. It it doesn't depend on the mission alone. It also depends on those countries in the Security Council or neighboring states. So it's really hard to know what is the mission itself and what are the surrounding factors.
If I may follow up on what Jennifer just said, what strikes me is that you look at a country. I mean, let's stay with the Democratic Republic of the Congo for a minute. It's a country that is bigger than the whole of Western Europe, and the peacekeeping mission at its highest had about the volume of forces that the New York Police Department has for a city of 8 million people. And so, what is miraculous actually is that sometimes it has an impact. But that makes the point that Jennifer was making, that you have to have a very wise and smart use of force, of intelligence, so that the confrontation that you have, you pick your fight, so to speak. So that in a way, peacekeeping in that context, there is an element of bluff in it, because in reality, it cannot protect the whole population that it is expected to protect. It has to it has to make choices, strategic choices that reverberate throughout the country and build the credibility. And over time, it gets harder and harder.
Okay. And Jean-Marie, if I could pose a question to you regarding Security Council. You already earlier mentioned how Security Council plays role, obviously, in organizing peacekeeping missions. They have to be authorized through Security Council. You also mentioned the importance of state interests when it comes to gaining support for peacekeeping missions. So, can you talk us a little bit about, tell us a little bit about political considerations within UN Security Council members when they design peacekeeping mandates? Can you share some gossip from Security Council?
Well, when the problem with the Security Council is that often when it turns to the United Nations for a peacekeeping mission, and in recent years it has done much less of that because it wants to, the key member states want to save money, and I think that is not certainly not going to change with the new American administration. But when it turns to the United Nations, it wants to show it's doing something, and that pretense is sometimes quite disconnected to the reality of what it is really prepared to support. There's a lot of hypocrisy in the Security Council. You know, in Libya, for instance, where there were no troops, just a political process. But in Libya, the Security Council kept saying, "Oh, we support the special representative. We want him to succeed." And the same members of the Security Council who were saying that were torpedoing the process by supporting one or the other party. And so this hypocrisy of the Security Council, which claims that it is acting for the good of humanity, and in too many situations is just pursuing narrow national goals. That is something that is, and now I am no longer working there, so I don't have to be cautious in my words. That's sometimes, to be honest, infuriating, that hypocrisy.
And do you think this is due to the fact that certain states just don't want to get involved and stay out of it, and they just want to play lip service to need to intervene, but then once it comes to organizing missions or taking a more of a stance, they don't authorize missions?
Well, it has, each situation has different explanations. In the case of Libya, which is not really peacekeeping, it was a political mission. But in the case of Libya, it's just different political goals. You had member states who were keen to support General Haftar, and others who were keen to support the government in Tripoli. In other situations, it's the unwillingness to take risk, and that's one of the big issues of the Security Council, is the gap, the difference between the countries that take the decisions and the countries that take the risks. Now, during the Yugoslav war, there was an overlap. The Europeans were greatly engaged in Yugoslavia. But the Americans, for instance, were only in the air; they were not on the ground, and that was already a big problem because they were not taking the risk in the air that the Europeans were taking on the ground. Now, in most peacekeeping missions, you see relatively few Europeans, and most of the risks are taken by troops from countries of the global south who are not happy with that because they believe, and they are not wrong, that the Security Council is giving them very tough mandates in situations where there's not much peace to keep. But the same members of the Security Council are not prepared to share in the risks. And so there's a feeling that they're just there to be hit. And that worsens when it's with troops from the African Union. You have seen in Somalia the difficulty of that because an urban environment, Mogadishu, it's very, very difficult, very dangerous. All troops, all armies of the world know that. And so the Western countries don't want to take those risks. They want to stay away from that. They had the experience in the 90s. They don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. They leave it to troops that often are much less trained, well equipped to face the risk. And so that creates a very unpleasant situation in the Security Council. This disconnect between those who pay, those who decide, and those who take the risks.
Okay, thank you. I would like to bring up another ethical dilemma in peacekeeping. So, prioritization of peace over justice. Should peacekeepers prioritize peace over justice? Let's say they are in a fragile environment, and should they be going after war criminals or violent parties, knowing that this could derail fragile peace process? What are your thoughts? Perhaps this could be a question for both of the panelists.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It depends. I always think in this dilemma, it depends a bit about how you think about justice and what forms of justice we can see in a society. Of course, criminal accountability and criminal forms of justice uh, are only one manifestation of what justice can mean. But there have been situations where individual members of missions, the special representative of the Secretary General has faced the decision: do we comply with a request from either, if we're looking at a country where the ICC is not present, it's an international criminal tribunal, or the ICC, to arrest individuals who have been alleged to commit uh, war crimes or crimes against humanity or ethnic cleansing. And I think these are really difficult decisions because they can, uh, in this instance, affect the impartiality of a mission in a slightly different way, in that it isn't so much that the mission would be accused of treating parties in a way that is unfair between them, but rather that the mission is somehow operationalizing an international commitment to pursuing a certain form of justice in a conflict. So we've seen real variation in the degree to which individuals and missions have been keen to do that or willing to do that, even in the same context. And I think this, gets to a question of the individual judgments that that those operating missions have to make. And Jean Marie alluded to this, that there is, in a sense, all the dilemmas we talked about. Values may seem to conflict, you may have trade-offs, but also if you are an official in a peace operation, you have a role responsibility that also comes with your position. And in some cases, if you're a special representative of the Secretary General, you are responsible for the welfare of others in your mission as well. And you have to think about the longer term. And if participating in an action to arrest someone can put parts of the mission at risk down the road because they are perceived as being um, partial, that's a consideration you weigh. And so these are not easy decisions. It's a slightly different point, but I think it illustrates it. We saw, for example, in Sudan, in Darfur, after certain civilian actors were asked to help provide information that would assist in the execution of arrest warrants, they were booted out of the country. They were made persona non grata. So these are really, really difficult. But we have seen individuals in peace operations take those difficult decisions in support of an ICC arrest warrant. And so, you know, it in real terms it can happen, but I don't want to minimize how difficult those choices sometimes are.
Yes, and I would make a difference between international justice and national justice. I think in all conflict-affected countries, it's really of great importance to help rebuild a credible judiciary, so that people have a sense of accountability, and you begin to rebuild trust among the people that there are responsibilities and people are accountable. International justice is much more complicated, and well, the example of Sudan was just mentioned. So for instance, prosecuting Bashir over time, it certainly helped uh, diminish his credibility, and you can say that international justice played a role in weakening his grip on the country and eventually leading to his downfall. At the same time, when you go that way, and you're not prepared to go all the way, because certainly, as we were discussing earlier, the international community is not prepared to provide the troops that, let's say, would affect regime change in Sudan, neither now nor then. You can weaken both justice and peace.
Mm,
You weaken justice because it's for everybody to see that nothing is being that it's not being implemented, and you weaken peace because if you accuse someone of the most serious crime of genocide, crimes against humanity, that makes any negotiation more difficult, and so you deprive yourself of a unwieldy but maybe inevitable course of action where you would negotiate with actual thugs without having the capability to remove those thugs. And that's an issue. There are other cases where, and so it depends in a way on the strength of the person who is indicted. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, you had some local warlords who were indicted, and that was a good thing in the sense that it deflated them, and it did instill a degree of fear among other warlords. So justice has to be meted on those who deserve it, but it has to be done in a very careful way. And too often it's done just to feel good rather than to see how it will further the interest of justice and the interest of peace. So I don't think it's peace against justice. It's both can be pursued, but in an intelligent and highly political way.
Okay, thank you both. I would like to ask one more question to both of you, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. We are very lucky to have a very engaged audience with some great questions here in the chat. So my last question would be about future of peacekeeping, and that's also will is something we're going to explore here in a minute in the Q&A section. So, how should peacekeeping evolve to better respond to contemporary conflicts? For example, climate-induced conflicts, which is something that we've been talking about for years now. Also, how should peacekeeping deal with challenges represented by cyber warfare, misinformation, and so on? And if you both just could briefly reflect on this.
Yeah, I do want to come back to this question because I've seen some comments in the chat around whether our conversation so far is really reflecting, the current global environment. But I want to remind everyone who's listening, there are a number of active peace operations on the ground right now. um, Despite the fact that there's been many global challenges, those missions are still there, and the people in them are grappling with the dilemmas we've described. And so I think this whole question of exit, for example, from some of these missions and how this can be done in a principled way is really important, and perhaps we can come back to it. But to your question, I think it's become really clear that interference of various kinds with peacekeeping has become very, very common. And there's external actors who are working both in the physical space and in the digital space to erode the legitimacy of missions and manipulate the political space in which they operate. And they really limit peace operations effectiveness, particularly if they create real disinformation about what the mission is doing or designed to do. So there's a few ways that states who are not host states are contributing to these kinds of interference. So one is through the deployment. This is something we haven't talked about, of what are known as parallel security actors, private military companies into different mission contexts. We've seen that. We've also seen states spreading mis and disinformation in and around a mission context. And then we've seen threats to the cybersecurity and integrity of UN-owned information. And as you were alluding to, Eurus, these kinds of tactics are undermining some of those underlying conditions for peacekeeping, degrading the trust of the local population, in some cases restricting missions' freedom of movement and their access to reliable information. And that information, let's remember, really helps them anticipate and respond to threats. And it's also offering some of the leaders in the host states alternative security partners that have fewer demands on them, political demands and governance demands. So given the UN's operating principles, impartiality, host state consent, use of force only in self-defense, it has really limited means to fight back against some of these new forms of interference. But we are seeing efforts to do so, to think more about, for example, in some contexts, UN radio is still really important. You might be thinking, does this matter anywhere anymore? But it still does matter. And thinking a lot about the content of messages, how mis and disinformation is countered, discussions between the civilian components of missions and local populations. I mean, it's very interesting that, again, I'll come back to the Congo, but we could give other examples where the perception of the UN mission really differs depending on where you are in the country. And that is, in some cases, a reflection of who the mission is partnering with, but also in terms of the information that civilians are getting. So the UN is trying to catch up to address mis and disinformation. And there's a term that's used for the way in which the UN mission tries to communicate, and that's through strategic communications. And that is a field, I think, which is really experiencing renewed efforts to improve and learn.
Yeah, two quick points on your question. First, in today's peacekeeping, there is no such thing as a conflict that is limited to one country. In every conflict now, there is international interference. either by global powers like Russia or by regional powers, depending on where the conflict is. So that means that if you don't address the backstage politics, so to speak, of the conflict, you will get nowhere. And that makes it very difficult because, of course, the backstage politics, when it's about Russia, the international order, uh, not easy to address. It's above the capacity of the UN. And the second thing is that cyber warfare is a new theater of war. That directly, there is a thought that it's only for high-tech countries. That's wrong. When you look at what has happened in the Sahel, cyber was a big factor in shaping public opinion in Mali, for instance, with real campaigns. And so there, if the UN is not equipped to deal with that, and radio is useful, but it's not enough. If the UN is not equipped to deal with those new theaters, it loses. It clearly loses. But to be equipped doesn't mean for the UN building a whole new cyber capacity. It probably means partnering with corporations or with countries that have that cyber capacity, and then that raises another question, which was raised by Jennifer, which is a question of impartiality. Because in a battle that's becoming a geopolitical battle, can you counter external manipulation that is done with highly sophisticated means? Can you counter it without yourself relying on some country that wants to counter that interference?
Okay. Now, as we are turning to the chat, I see there are a lot of questions about contemporary or recent developments. So let's tackle the hard questions. So here's one question from Sosi. How are you going to navigate between Trump's possible defunding of UN and also opposition of Russia and other countries like Russia to UN peacekeeping missions?
Well, I think there is no doubt that peacekeeping is in a phase of contraction because it's not just defunding, it's lack of political support. In peacekeeping, success depends, yes, on concrete commitments of troops, mandates, etc., but it depends on a measure of political backing by the countries that wield real power. And if that political backing isn't there, you have a very weak hand. And so I think the divisions in the international community, the profound divide in the international community, means that troublemakers can always play one against the other. So there's going to be a much weaker peacekeeping activity of the UN in coming years. Will it disappear? I don't think so, because at the same time, there may be areas where there is an interest in joining forces. And I think much will depend there on the attitude of China. Russia is disruptive. Russia believes that its best leverage is to create chaos. And maybe that's now also the view of the United States. We don't know. We'll find out. But it looks like it. China, as a global power, believes that it needs a predictable world, a world with some order. And so it doesn't like the idea that there are more and more spaces that would become ungoverned, that would be chaotic. And so there may be an interest of China in investing in peacekeeping. So I think much will depend on whether the European countries, Canada, China can work out some kind of understanding on the future of peacekeeping. That's where there is some hope, but it's a very difficult moment for peacekeeping.
Yeah, I think, here it's important for us not to be held hostage by the present and to keep our imaginations alive, right? So we can't necessarily predict those situations in which it might seem a faraway prospect, but that Security Council members might come together because their interests might converge, to authorize another mission. But we also have regional forms of peacekeeping that are important here to consider. So we had a Security Council resolution in late 2023, Security Council Resolution 2719, which was much more aimed at empowering the UN to support more regionally led peace operations. And that might be done with active partnership with a UN personnel, but it might also be done much more as a form of delegation. And I think, what we should be watching for is the upcoming peacekeeping ministerial meeting in May that's being held in Germany, where there's going to be a lot of discussion around future models that could be deployed as we move forward. Certain tasks that peacekeeping missions have engaged in and how those might be combined in new ways in the future. We should also remember that missions might not involve blue helmets. They might be what is referred to as special political missions. And I think the question there, if they are mostly civilian personnel, is whether they can play any kind of role in protection, which has been one of the big novelties of the last 25 years, that peace operations have had protection at their core. And I think that's something that is being discussed in the run up to this ministerial. So watch this space. Peacekeeping is still a very, very interesting area of international public policy. But Jean-Marie is right that the context for it is really changing, and the kinds of missions we have seen there, we might see a contraction, but new kinds of configurations instead.
Okay. One of the questions in the chat was about Syria and Ukraine. Do you see peacekeeping or peacekeeping-like missions in these two conflict areas?
Well, I think in Ukraine, it's the Europeans like to talk about peacekeeping forces, but to be honest, it's to reassure their public opinion, because it's nothing to do with peacekeeping. It's about capacity for Ukraine to deter another Russian aggression. So I don't know if it will happen, but the label peacekeeping is a bit misleading. I understand that it's expedient for political reasons, but it's not really peacekeeping. Syria is a different issue. Clearly, when you've seen what happened in the Alawite part of Syria on the coast, having some kind of impartial process to broker to broker a stable peace between the various Syrian groups and the Syrian government would be a good thing. And Geir Pedersen is the envoy of the United Nations, and he's a very smart and competent envoy. But the problem is that because the UN has been around for many years, not being able to do anything for a number of years, the credibility of the UN is low in Syria. So I think in one way it would be very good to have an impartial broker to manage a political process in Syria, not necessarily with troops, maybe just a special political, maybe just an expansion of the existing special political mission. But at the same time, I believe it's not an easy sell to the Syrian. It's interesting to see how Russia, when it had the upper hand in Syria, in a way sidelined the UN with Turkey in the Astana process. Now that it no longer has the upper hand, it's more interested in the UN. So it very much depends on the political interest of the key players in Syria.
I just want to add to what Jean-Marie said, that when we're thinking about Ukraine and the discussions there right now, we're really talking about a deterrent force. It's not, if you think about the principles that we outlined at the beginning that lie behind peacekeeping, that's not the kind of force that's being discussed. So it is interesting that idea of peacekeeping, cloaking it in that, appeals to political discussions at the moment. But I think we need to be clear about what that force would be, and how it would be designed for that objective. Even though the mandates of peacekeeping operations are often very unwieldy because they're the product of compromise, they have a purpose and objective, and that comes through. And I think in the discussions around Ukraine, we can see that deterrence is really what that is, what those discussions are aimed at.
Okay, great. I'm looking at the chat, and then there's another interesting question about ethical dilemmas, which is about how to navigate challenges of cultural sensitivity over universal norms. For example, in peacekeeping, for example, in some parts of Kenya, female genital mutilation is a tradition, and then how to navigate peacekeeping in such a environment. So I don't know if there's necessarily a question there, but more broadly, perhaps you could reflect that. How do you navigate local cultural challenges or norms versus universal human norms, and then environment if peacekeepers operate in it? Are there some sort of ethical dilemmas there?
I definitely think there's some risks, I would say. I mean, firstly, there's some very interesting research that shows that language skills and cultural affinities in the makeup of mission personnel, particularly military components, can actually make a difference in effectiveness. I didn't get into that before. It's still quite um, modest research, but it's fascinating. On this question of the local and the global, I think I can give you an example that highlights this. And again, I would describe it as a tension. So, what you see now as a normative idea, not just in peacekeeping, but in humanitarian action, in refugee protection, is this idea of localization, that local actors should be at the forefront, owning their solutions. And so sometimes what this looks like in a peacekeeping mission is UN military, but mainly civilian personnel trying to support the creation of community based protection mechanisms, local dialogue committees, all of which I think is really positive. But what you also sometimes see is that those committees can reinforce pre existing hierarchies or forms of exclusion. So they can be created either with some very significant gender imbalances, so women are not included as part of these committees, or they're done in such a way that they reproduce some of the identity based or ethnic conflicts. And I think that's a real dilemma for support of those. In my view, and this is not to take anything away from the UN, I think some of the NGOs that are involved in contexts like Civic and Oxfam and others are actually a bit better at navigating some of these risks because their field presence is more sustained and more embedded in local communities, and they have the opportunity to affect some of those some of those dynamics in more productive ways. But it is a dilemma.
I have nothing to add to that. I think there's a permanent dilemma between building on the local norms and injecting some kind of universalism and finding the balance between the two is incredibly difficult.
Yeah. Well, as I'm looking on my clock, I see we are almost out of time. So I wanted to see if there are any like final remarks that our two panelists would like to say before I thank everyone and we conclude this event.
Well, no, Jennifer, you want to?
I just wanted to I think the chat's been really fascinating about our listeners and viewers' anxieties about the future of peacekeeping, their worry about the geopolitical environment. But there were also a couple of comments made about the harm that missions can sometimes do, including through sexual exploitation, through other examples of mission behavior and unintended, in some cases, unintended consequences of action. I think this is really important to keep in mind. That any time, and Jean-Marie made this comment at the start, you are inserting yourself in a local conflict context with external actors. And these are some of the really difficult consequences that while you are trying to make a difference, you can also at times do harm. And we should make sure we acknowledge that.
I'll have just one word. I think peacekeeping has reinvented itself several times in its long history. It needs to reinvent itself today. It needs more imagination. I think there is a need to find different ways of operating, maybe more in supporting countries in their own difficulties so that they have more ownership with all the issues that come with getting closer to a country that you want to help. But I think at the moment there has to be more planning for the future, more revolutionary thinking, that the multi-dimensional missions that were in a way the standard mission at the time when I was leading peacekeeping, that's over. But I don't think that means peacekeeping is over.
Yeah, and from my end, I just really want to thank both of our distinguished panelists for extremely insightful remarks. In less than an hour, or in roughly 1 hour, we were able to touch on so many different nuances and aspects of peacekeeping, both with regards to ethics, past and present, and perhaps future. And I think we all are leaving this meeting with much better understanding about peacekeeping and ethics surrounding it. And also, I want to thank the audience. It's always a wonderful thing to have active audience as we had right now. And I hope all these audience members will also stay tuned with future Carnegie virtual events like this, addressing important issues in ethics in contemporary world. So thank you.